necessary being is God. Aquinas spelled out the reasoning of his argument from contingency this way. There are contingent things. Contingent things can cause other contingent things, but there can't only be contingent things, because that would mean that there's an infinite regress of contingency and a possibility that nothing might have existed. An infinite regress is impossible, so there must be at least one necessary thing. And that is God. Let that marinate in your brain for a minute while unpacking the next argument. This one is built on the idea that we simply need a measuring stick in order to understand the value of things. Good, bad, big, small, hot, cold, none of these concepts can exist in isolation. If you go out for a walk and you see an animal, it's like this big, that animal would be on the small side if it turned out to be a dog. But if it were a rat, that would be huge. How do we know? Because we gauge the size of things in terms of other things. The same idea applies to more abstract concepts, like your grades. How do we know that an A is good? Because it's at the top. We know that there are grades lower than an A, but nothing higher. And Aquinas thought that all our value concepts would just be floating randomly in space if there weren't some anchor, something that defined the value of everything else by being perfect. And that, again, is God. This is how Aquinas developed number 4, known as argument from degrees. Properties come in degrees. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect against which everything else is measured. God is the pinnacle of perfection. Okay, we've considered Aquinas' 4 cosmological arguments, but remember, that's only step 1. The next and equally important step in philosophy is critical evaluation. So what do we make of them? As philosophers, if you think an argument is flawed, it's your job to try and figure out why. And by and large, philosophers, theists and atheists alike, have been relatively unimpressed by these 4, having found many problems in them. For one thing, these arguments don't seem to establish the existence of any particular God. Even if the arguments are correct, it doesn't look like Aquinas gets us to the personal, loving God that many people pray to. Instead, we're left with unmoved movers and uncaused causers who seem to have little in common with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who feels emotions and cares about his creation and answers prayers. Basically, this objection says that Aquinas' God is so far removed from the God that theists actually believe in that it doesn't help anything. But maybe you're happy just believing someone's out there, that's fine. But then, how about multiple someones? Because guess what? Aquinas' arguments don't rule out polytheism. There's nothing in any of his arguments to prove that God isn't actually like a committee. Aquinas' cosmological arguments also don't prove the existence of a sentient God. So it might be an old guy with a beard, it might be 6 old guys with beards, but it also might be an egg, or a turtle, or just a big block of stone. These observations have made some philosophers uncomfortable with Aquinas' ultimate conclusion. But there are 2 objections that are thought by some to be real nails in its coffin. The first is simply that Aquinas was wrong in his insistence that there can't be an infinite regress of anything. Aquinas takes it as a given that there had to be a starting point for everything, whether it's the movement of objects, or causes and effects, or contingent beings being created. But it's unclear that this is true, or why it has to be true. If infinite regress can be possible, then Aquinas' first 2 arguments fall apart. But perhaps the most significant charge made against Aquinas' arguments is that they're self-defeating. That is, they actually prove themselves wrong. For example, if Aquinas is right that everything must have been put into motion by something else, and everything must have a cause other than itself, then it seems that God should be subject to those same stipulations. And if God is somehow exempt from those rules, then why couldn't other things be exempt from them too? If they can exist without God being responsible for them, then we don't need God to establish things in the first place. Alright, I feel like I've given you a lot to think about. So before we close, let's pause and remind ourselves about a couple of things. First, you can accept a conclusion but reject an argument. So you might agree with Aquinas that God exists, but think none of his arguments prove it. Second, if you disagree with an argument, you don't just get to say, yeah, you're wrong. You have to give a counter-argument. What did Aquinas get wrong, and how can you do better? Why are your reasons superior to his? Remember, philosophy is a dialectic. Yes, Aquinas has been dead for centuries, but he started a conversation, and you get to participate in that when you engage with his arguments and offer your own, either in an effort to help him out by fixing flaws in his arguments while preserving his conclusion, or by refuting his entire project. This is what it means to do philosophy, to engage with arguments about stuff that matters, and whether or not there's a God seems to matter quite a bit, particularly in the lives of theists. Today we learned about cosmological arguments and considered 4 of them. Next time we'll look at Aquinas' 5th argument, the teleological argument.
Right, first I will show you the Ghazali, what the Ghazali book wrote in his book. He wrote a book especially تحافظ الفلاسفة, that the philosophers fight and infight and incoherence. So if you go to the book, this is one of the things I will mention later. He talk about the causation, that nothing happened by itself. If anything happened, somebody has caused that to happen. And the motion, that the universe had to have somebody moving it. He actually put the motion second, while Aquinas put the motion first. And about the contingency, eventuality, you might or might not exist, but Allah must exist. And the infinite regress, it's impossible, and also mentioned in Al-Ghazali book. Now in the Quran, when you go, obviously nothing creates itself, or herself or itself. Even Allah did not create himself. So nothing creates itself, including Allah. So Allah always there, and He created. Now, obviously, philosopher was wrong because the universe has been created. They found a start to the universe. When Hubble came with the Big Bang theory, and the universe was not there 13.7 billion years ago, it was actually first 25 billion. Now they reduced it to 13.7. Einstein said, I was shocked, how idiot he was, that the universe actually had a start, it wasn't there before. So there's no infinite regress. There were a start and move. So the first start, causation of starting, and then moved it. Allah moved it. And our sun loses every day, every second, it loses 4 billion kilograms of mass, every single second. So one day will die. And if it was eternal, it would have died ages ago. So Allah said, وَهُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ. He's the one who created the heavens and earth in 6 days. And before that, His throne was on water. So they were water before this universe. Obviously, scientists didn't discover that. They won't be able to discover it. And Allah said, ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى إِلَى السَّمَاءِ وَهِيَ دُخَانٌ. So He created the gas first, and then He moved it. وَقَالَ لَهَا وَلِلْأَرْضِ ائْتِيَا طَوْعًا أَوْ كَرْهًا قَالَتَا أَتَيْنَا طَائِعِينَ. And they started forming the galaxies. So He created the heavens. It was, all the creation was a smoke. And then He formed the earth and the rest of galaxies. And then they were one piece and split apart. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. Made from water every living thing. So the heavens and earth were one piece and then exploded, split apart, and enlarging. وَاللَّهُ وَالسَّمَاءُ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. So they were a creator from nothing, the causer, then the mover, moved it and expanding. And Aquinas' argument doesn't seem to establish the existence of any particular God. This is why Allah sent prophets.
No,
this is why the prophets came.
The argument in the video is misrepresented, just to be clear. But it's
it changed what Aquinas said.
No, it's not that. It's incomplete, and a lot of
leave it today. Leave it today. You muddle things up. And then Allah said, كَانَ النَّاسُ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً فَبَعَثَ اللَّهُ النَّبِيِّينَ مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ. People were believing in Allah when resources started becoming limited and the number increased, and they start arguing among themselves and denying Allah asked this and denying Allah asked that. Allah sent messengers to correct things, put things back in order. And Allah will not punish anyone who hasn't met a messenger, haven't heard of a messenger. The message didn't get to him. So that's the problem solved as well. When He said insensitive God, Allah is sensitive. Allah responds to your dua. And this is why the dua, أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَ إِذَا دَعَاهُ. You request from Allah Azza wa Jal, Allah will answer you and remove the hardship, remove the calamity. And He made you khulafa al-ard. You are in charge of earth. That will come later again when they will talk about Allah created imperfect earth. And that will be really interesting as well to know. So necessary being, all of us contingency being, all the universe. Obviously Allah is the one who is always there. And He is a necessary being to create everything created. But the fact that He is there because He created. We know He created the universe, so He is the creator. It didn't come from nothing. And Allah is wajib al-wujud. And again, Allah didn't create Himself, and Allah is mawjud, always there. We don't have to say wajib al-wujud. We don't force His existence. He existed, this is why He created. Because the creation there means there were a creator who created. And the last thing, you always have to remember, nothing similar to Allah. And then he goes to the intelligent designs. Really, again, it's quite interesting. I think we have enough time for Maghrib.
Things that we need to raise in that, because
Yeah,
I think
just write it down and then we will talk about it.
But this agenda doesn't really cover it.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in when we stop, inshallah. There's more challenge in this video from the philosopher and atheist, obviously.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
Over the centuries, the effort to craft a perfect, bulletproof argument for the existence of God has taken many forms. There was the ontological argument of Anselm, there were the 4 cosmological arguments of Aquinas, and they still have their supporters. But many modern philosophers feel that they're simply too flawed, too inconsistent with our scientific understanding of the universe to be convincing today. But there was a 5th argument posited by Thomas Aquinas, and it was popularized several hundred years after his time, in the late 1700s, by the English Christian philosopher William Paley. And this argument for God's existence is still around today, too. In fact, it's one of the most popular. It's known as the teleological argument. You may know it as intelligent design. To make his case for the existence of God, William Paley gave us what's known as an argument by analogy. This form of inductive argument invites us to consider a particular state of affairs. Let's just call it situation A, about which we're already likely to have certain beliefs, and then likens it to situation B, with which we are less familiar. The idea is that in the interest of consistency, whatever conclusions we've drawn about A, we ought to draw about B as well. You can make an argument by analogy about anything, but Paley used it to talk about God in what's known as the watchmaker analogy. He asked us to imagine what we would think if we found a watch on the ground. Would we imagine that the watch simply appeared randomly, spontaneously on its own? Or would we see the complexity of it and notice that its parts seem to come together in a particular way in order to accomplish a goal? If so, wouldn't we think that the watch must have been made by someone on purpose? Paley was arguing that the teleology demonstrated by a watch would lead us to conclude that it was designed by an intelligent creator with a particular end in mind. Teleological means goal-oriented or purposeful, and we can easily pick out the teleologies of man-made objects. Got a mug here, as an example. It was created with a particular teleology in mind. It was designed to hold a liquid without leaking. It's got a handle, put here deliberately in such a way that human fingers could easily fit into it, and its composition is such that it will keep the liquid inside warm without burning the hand that holds it. We wouldn't assume that a coffee cup would simply come to be exhibiting such perfect design for its particular function without someone having created it that way on purpose. So in the same way that the teleology of a cup implies the existence of a cup maker and that of a watch implies the existence of a watchmaker, Paley saw teleology in the world and assumed from that God's existence. He continued his analogy by comparing a watch to a living organism. Look at the complexity of the human body. Heart and lungs working together, producing sweat to keep ourselves from overheating, transforming food into energy. We're just generally amazing all around. Look at how elements of the natural world operate according to complex laws that sustain a beautiful natural harmony. Paley said that this couldn't possibly just have happened any more than the design of a pocket watch could just have happened. There must be a designer. If you accept this analogy, then you agree with Paley that just like the purposefulness of a watch compels us to believe in a watchmaker, the purposefulness of the world compels us to believe in a world maker, God. And you might think this is a fantastic argument. It might even be what motivates your own belief in God. There are lots of people who say things like sunsets and babies show them that there must be a designer God. But some of you probably aren't buying it, and you know what to do. Arguments are refuted by counter-arguments. So when you want to refute an argument by analogy, you offer a disanalogy. Basically, you demonstrate that situation A and situation B are dissimilar enough that the analogy doesn't actually work. So to object to Paley, we have to identify a way in which elements of the natural world, like human bodies, are relevantly dissimilar to watches. When we're talking about a watch, an objector might say, it obviously had a creator. After all, we can take it apart and see clearly how the gears fit together and move the hands and keep time. But there's so much in the natural world that isn't understandable in the same way. For instance, why would God have designed our eyes to have a blind spot? Paley responded that it doesn't matter whether we can understand how something was created. The point is simply that it was. He might point out, for instance, that I actually don't understand the inner workings of my phone, but I still know it had a creator, whether or not I understand how it was created created is beside the point. Next objection, some parts of nature seem to be without purpose. A blind spot obviously doesn't have any function, and neither do nipples on a man. Paley's response here was, just because you don't know there's a purpose doesn't mean there isn't one. But this is a problem too, because his whole argument for believing in God is that you should look at the world and see purpose. So if we see some things in the world that are working great and really seem to have complexity and definite use, and others that don't, that's a flaw in his argument. What's more, the absence of any obvious purpose in things can lead people to start searching for purposes, effectively making them up. For instance, I could find a purpose for this finger. I could use it as a nose picker. It would make a good one. It's just the right size to really get in there and dig around, but was my finger designed to pick noses? Probably not. 20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell made fun of this purpose-finding tendency by pointing out that you could look at a bunny and form the belief that God gave it a fuzzy white tail so hunters would have something to shoot at. The point is, if we're the ones inventing purposes rather than recognizing ones that are inherently there, then we're the real creators of purpose in the world, not God. Basically, if you believe that God made eyes for seeing, then you also have to believe that he designed fingers as nose pickers and rabbit tails as bullseyes and blind spots as ways for us to get into car accidents. So the counter-argument here is we don't just get to pick and choose and say God designed the stuff we want him to have designed and not the other stuff. Rather than searching for disanalogies, another way Paley's argument has been countered is with an alternative explanation for condition B. Paley says that bodies are purposeful and from there concludes that the purpose had to have been put there by an intelligent creator. But another explanation for how bodies came to have the complexity and functionality they have today is natural selection and random mutation. We can concede that the existence of a designer God helped make sense of the origins of the world in a pre-scientific age, but now we have a perfectly good scientific explanation for how the complexity of the world came about. So who needs a watchmaker when you have evolution by natural selection? Another objection to Paley's case came from the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, who pointed out that if we're to take the analogy seriously, we'd need to conclude that the creator that Paley posits seems to make a lot of mistakes. And not just blind spots, like how about hurricanes? Or why would he make bodies with certain tissues, like in the breast, prostate, or colon, that are so incredibly prone to cancer? Why would he make umbilical cords that could wrap around a baby's neck? Why would he make butterflies have to wait for hours immobile for their wings to dry as soon as they come out of their chrysalis, making them easy prey for predators? Hume pointed out that the world is chock full of stuff that looks cruel, ridiculous, impractical, and contrary to life. A flawed world, he said, implies a flawed creator. Now, the development of evolutionary biology over the past couple hundred years has taken a pretty heavy toll on the teleological argument, but it still has many supporters, and their method for defending their view is a good model for the way the Socratic method is supposed to work. When opponents raise objections to your theory, you need to either reject it or modify it in a way that responds to those objections. So supporters of the teleological argument set out to modify and strengthen their view. Here are a couple modern responses. Contemporary British philosopher Richard Swinburne gives us a modern teleological argument with a twist of probability. He says that even if there's another possible explanation for the universe, we should go with the explanation that's most likely to be true. And he says that it's simply more probable that God designed the world than that it came about through the pure chance of evolutionary processes. Likewise, another class of modern defenses of the teleological argument are collectively known as fine-tuning arguments. These arguments accept the Big Bang and evolution as scientific truths, but they maintain that for the evolution of life to occur, it's most likely that God set up the precise conditions that it required, rather than them coming about by accident. After all, if Earth were just a little closer to or farther from the sun, if the composition of the atmosphere was slightly different, if the content of our oceans was something other than what it is, life would have never taken root. A lot of people think these modernized arguments have more going for them than Paley's did. This is partly because these types of teleologists have moved from making assertions about certainty to making claims about probability, which seem easier to get right and to defend. Objectors will counter by saying that the problem with these arguments is you can't really make a probability claim when you only have a sample set of one. If we had multiple Earths that we could examine, we could see how likely any particular adaptation is or how unique the conditions for life are. Then we would know if it were likely or unlikely to happen without God. But we can't know that, at least not now, because we can only access this one world where we know that things evolved as they did. Thus, the counter-argument goes, Swinburne and other modern teleologists are right to recognize that if things were slightly different, then life maybe wouldn't have evolved or would have evolved very differently. But that is wholly different from claiming that it's unlikely to have happened in the first place. So, today, you learned about the teleological argument, objections to it, and responses to those objections, and the responses to the responses to the objection.
Right, okay. So there's a cup maker, the watch is watchmaker, and there's the world maker. This is one of the list of things they said. We'll take it one by one. First, Allah Azza wa Jalla addressed it that خلق السماوات والأرض أكبر من خلق الناس. Creation of the heaven and earth far much greater than creating the man, because you have to create the atoms first, multiple atoms and the heavier atoms and magnesium, sodium, potassium, iron, gold, silver, and then Allah Azza wa Jalla said, anyway, I've never took them as witnesses to the creation of heavens and earth. All of what they say is guessing. They're guessing, this is what it is, this is what it's that. And I wouldn't take those who are وَمَا كُنْتُم مُتَّخِذَ الْمُضِلِّينَ عَضُدًا. How we call them, he led men astray. Those who led men astray, I wouldn't take them as helpers. So that's on one side. On another side, they need to think again. Are they created from nothing? Or were they the creator? Obviously that's no. Allah is the creator. Now before this ayah, is actually there's an ayah I brought, but the system went collapsed. But anyway, the ayah Allah Azza wa Jalla said, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. Allah said to the angels, I'm going to create a vicegerent on earth. What the angels said, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاء. Are you going to create there somebody who will create a lot of mischief and shed the blood? So obviously there were creations on earth who were fighting each other, shedding blood, whatever, whether they were human like us, Neanderthal man or Lucy or whatever creatures or just the animals, we don't know. But earth wasn't perfect. And Allah knows that, the angels knew that. It wasn't a perfect place. But what Allah did, Allah created Adam in paradise, where there's perfect wood, the ideal wood. Allah Azza wa Jalla said to him, وَقُلْنَا يَا آدَمُ إِنَّ هَذَا عَدُوٌ لَكَ وَزَوْجِكَ فَلَا يُخْرِجَنَّكَ مِنَ الْجَنَّةِ فَتَشْقَى وَقُلْنَا يَا آدَمُ اسْكُنْ أَنْتَ وَزَوْجُكَ الْجَنَّةَ. It's a lot of ayah. Enjoy living in Jannah. You will have plenty of eat and drink and move around. But don't get the shaitan get you out, because you will suffer. Tashqa is not a perfect life on earth. It's not going to be perfect. You will suffer on earth. Try not to get out of paradise, because that's not a good place to live in on earth. In Jannah, you will never go hungry. You will never go undressed. You will never go thirsty. You will never have any difficulties. You don't even have a sun heat. You will not have any cold, nothing. You will enjoy a perfect life in Jannah. What man did? He got himself out of Jannah. He came to earth with all the problems on earth. Allah didn't say, I'm putting you in a perfect place. Allah said, you are now in perfect place in paradise. Stay there. And you chose to go to earth. And it's your problem. It's your choice. Allah الذي خلق السماوات والأرض سبع سماوات. No, Allah Azza wa Jalla created 7 heavens. He said there's only one earth. We can't know. No, there's 7 earths. Try to find them. If you're lucky, you will find that Almighty of Allah Azza wa Jalla even on this earth. And He scattered creatures around them. You're not the only creature in the universe. There's many creatures like you who are scattering around the universe. Probability, there's a short video I want to show you. Maghrib is actually in 5 minutes, 4 minutes. We probably will stop now. I might want to make wudu and we'll pray Maghrib, and we'll come back after Maghrib. We will try to assemble probably 10 past, see how it goes, 10 past 4 inshallah. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.